Welcome back, scholars. By popular demand, I guess, by demand of somewhat, we're going to have just an example art critique today to help you prep for exams, writing the formal critiques, and otherwise just being better at art history and humanities. So you've seen the art toolkit, you've followed the top tips, you know that you're starting out on the big ideas and working your way into the details. You know that you're bringing us not only what you think, but why you think that by looking at evidence and connecting it to what you're seeing. But what does that actually look like in practice? Let's do one of our classic High Renaissance pieces. So if we were studying the Renaissance in your class, you would be expected to be able to say, what are the attributes of the High Renaissance and how is this representative of that style? So let us begin with, we have Leonardo da Vinci's Virgin of the Rocks, and this one is the original. We're going to look at the remake that he did about 10 or 20 years later just to look at the comparative differences and what we can glean from that in a minute. So our main piece right now is the 1480s Da Vinci Virgin of the Rocks. And so what we have just to start with there is oil on canvas, which is our medium. Our genre is painting. So we've got an oil painting on canvas. Technique, we don't have to get weird like it was with paintbrushes, so it doesn't really need mentioning because it's not unusual for what we're dealing with. Certainly with the High Renaissance in Italy, the fact that the medium is oil paint matters because we had that great exchange, right? Where the North had developed this oil paint technology. It allowed that sort of very realistic skin tone. It allowed that incredible detail that you just can't get with tempera or gouache or watercolor or any of the other media that we had had before that. And the exchange that the South, the Italians, gave to the North in this great sort of Renaissance awakening is that the secrets of realism. So what we have for this realistic representation of the natural world, we have our proportion. So the anatomical proportions, those naturalistic poses, we absolutely have those that are coming directly from that rebirth of Greek and Roman sculpture that was what the Renaissance is named after, right? It means rebirth, and it's rebirth of those classical aesthetics and ideals in philosophy as well as art. And then we've got the secret to that realistic three-dimensional space on a flat two-dimensional picture plane. And that is from vanishing point perspective or linear perspective, depending on which one you want to go with, where the train tracks get closer together as they get farther away. And then, of course, atmospheric perspective, which is how with 20/20 vision or human normal vision, things get blurrier into the extreme distance. So things are going to get blurrier, the colors are going to get muted, you get that sort of mistiness, whereas the main sort of depth of focus is going to be in that foreground and midground, and that atmospheric perspective fading into the background. So we certainly have those here to the point where Leonardo da Vinci had a super saturated atmospheric perspective style known as sfumato, named after his work. So we've got sfumato in this piece. If you look behind that rock formation at the sort of mistiness of that valley and maybe a river there, you've got that sfumato, super saturated atmospheric perspective fog machine thing going on. Linearly, all right, let's look at focal point and point of view. That's going to help us kind of decide whether or not this is an engaged piece. We're going to say focal point, you're looking at directly in the center. You've got kind of cut down the middle. You've got the pretty lady face, right? You've got that top center figure of Mary. And she is going to be our primary focal point. Certainly it's because she's kind of in the center of the composition. She's the first face as we're sort of reading top left to bottom right. And then also we have those interlocking hand gestures. So you see certainly she's looking at Christ, who is kind of motioning back up and looking at John the Baptist, who is motioning back up. We've got a lot of fingers kind of pointing and gesturing between the four characters there, and they're all kind of bringing us into this equilateral triangle. So you've got this sort of focal point zone of an equilateral triangle, and having that primary geometric shape as your main composition point, that's very high Renaissance, right? We're certainly not going to go with something that's off center. Our whole point is perfecting perfect, right? We've got that perfection of ideal beauty. So our female characters here are our classic Italian high Renaissance beauties. They've both got that kind of teardrop, upside down teardrop oval face with the pointed chin. We've got the high cheekbones, the very heavy lidded eyes, the long slender nose, the thin lips, all of those attributes that give us that high Renaissance Italian look. Once we get into that primary composition, you can see that we've got a bit of the color scheme, bringing those pops of color of that interesting sort of chartreuse green on the angel's robes. Mary is almost always wearing blue. That's kind of one of our shorthands that we've been developing since the medieval period, and certainly before that in art, that the Virgin Mary wears blue. And she's got a red gown and a gold sash under there, but her main cloak and robe is blue. And then we have a little bit of a complement with the angel wearing that sort of orange and green. But overall, because of that warmth of the browns with our background and our foreground and our environment there, we've got a warm analogous color scheme. It's very warm. The skin tones are warm. It feels very golden, sunlight, Mediterranean-y with our light source. And again, with foreground, midground, background, it's very high Renaissance that we do have with our point of view. We're somewhat straight on, right? We don't have any kind of bird's eye view looking down from the sky. We're not worm's eye view looking up from somewhere low. We're kind of looking straight on with the Holy Family here. Well, not quite all of them. We have Mary, we have baby Jesus, we have John the Baptist, and the angel. With those, we have this comfortable foreground, right? And that's very high Renaissance that we get to have that sort of space between us and the main event, which kind of can sometimes give it that theatrical, disengaged sort of feeling that we have this comfortable distance as a viewer. However, the angel is making eye contact with the viewer, right? She's turned and she's looking at us, pointing at the infant. So that is certainly engaging us, right? We are being acknowledged by the figures in the painting that we exist and we are part of this conversation, part of this scene. So I would say that that's engaged because one of the figures, the angel, is making eye contact. All right, so we've looked at focal point of view. We've given it that overall kind of composition on why I've found that primary geometric shape of an equilateral triangle in the piece. We've found our color scheme, and I've pointed to why. Even though we've got some blue in there, we've got some green in there. You could argue a lot of different ways, but I'm going to say overall we've got this very warm analogous color scheme. Certainly, we've got that sfumato, we've got vanishing point perspective, and we've also got kind of this hyper detail. Certainly over here in the foreground, you've got these botanical samples that are very realistic, very detailed, and that is certainly something that we can get with oil paint, but that's also a little bit of Da Vinci's scientific naturalism. And so we are getting into that naturalism of really studying the natural world as well. The folds in the fabric, we've got these beautiful sort of pools of folded fabric, and that is very Da Vinci, as we can point out with a couple of the other examples we've looked at. The figures, we've got our ideal high Italian Renaissance beauties that we've already discussed, but then the babies, we're back to those cute babies. So that brings us into the high Italian Renaissance rather than that pre-Renaissance transition where we kind of have the homunculus theory where Christ was born fully formed, therefore he kind of looked like a middle-aged man. But baby. We're into the High Renaissance where we've gone to that cute infant look, certainly for Christ as well as other children. The comparison that I have on why we get this sort of sunny mood to this piece is certainly the color scheme, and that is why I'm very much pointing towards a warm analogous color scheme. So if I were going to ask you to do a comparison between two pieces, oh, I can't move myself. Can I move this? Let's move this up. There we go. Sorry, warm versus cool. All right, we have the two different Virgin of the Rocks. Da Vinci had to come clean with his commission that he had already been partially paid for, so he did a second version for the church 10, maybe 20 years later. It's very iffy on when he completed this second one, but you can see that it is based on the same sketches, the same drawing, the same composition, right down to, if he was doing this from memory, he did an incredible job with creating that same grotto with the rock features, those stone formations in the background, kind of that cave overlook into the very sfumato, misty background that we have back there with our atmospheric perspective. We certainly have that sense of depth and space with vanishing point perspective. We have the same four figures, although it is a little bit different, right? The mood is completely different because our color scheme, our line, our composition, our figural interactions feel very similar. However, we've taken away having those bright reds and oranges in the fabrics of our female figures. We have taken away the sunshine and the happiness, and we've got this cool, very blue, very green overall color scheme happening here. It's very analogously cool, to the point where the temperature almost feels cold, and the people's skin is, I would say, olivey, but almost to the point of like a sickly green. So we have this certainly different mood shift with a darkness and a foreboding, certainly deeper shadows. And we've somewhat been taken out of the equation here. The angel is not perhaps engaging with us. She's got the same kind of turn of her head, but to me, her eyes look like she's gazing at the children, not making eye contact with the audience. We still have that comfortable foreground. We've got the main action happening in that midground, and then the long vanishing point perspective and atmospheric perspective background. So it still feels very high Renaissance. We've got the botanical study over here, although it's slightly different this time, but you've got that same concept for how the composition has been laid out. We've got everything is very similar except for that color scheme shifting to the cool tones, and it gives a completely different impression for whether or not it's a sunny, hopeful scene or if it's got a certain level of foreboding. And one additional point that kind of helps bolster that evidence that I feel as though this one, while we've still got the babies and the birth of Christ, both of these babies become martyrs. They are killed for their faith. And so we've got this moment here where there's actually a crucifix in the arms of the infant. And so that's very much giving us that spoiler alert towards what their gruesome demise will be. And so it takes the sunny innocence right on out of this composition. And so for me, certainly with the comparison here, while there's so much that is the same, I would point towards that overall color scheme going from warm to cool to really being the difference in feeling and tone and message. So I hope that helps. Certainly, let's just look at some of that descriptive vocab. Do you have to cover absolutely everything all the time? No. Usually there's going to be a few descriptive elements that really stick out to you. Certainly when I'm trying to say that the Da Vinci pieces are very high Renaissance, I'm going to be pointing at those different elements that make it high Renaissance, right? We've got the naturalistic poses with the figures. We have the vanishing point linear perspective. We've got the atmospheric perspective. We have a foreground, a midground, and a background. Primary geometric structure to the composition. Everything sort of looks very realistically natural but perfect, as evidenced by our high Italian Renaissance beauties that are ideals, right? Rather than perhaps naturalistically descriptive, like our Republican Roman statues, for example. So those are the things that I have highlighted in this critique because I think that's the evidence that points the most towards high Italian Renaissance being what we're looking at with the style of this particular piece. Certainly, space-ground relationships matter more in different pieces. The symmetry matters in quite a lot of them. Scale and basically every kind of descriptive vocab you can think of. It depends, though I would always start with our genre, medium, technique if necessary or interesting. Getting that idea of describing the composition, making sure that you're addressing focal point and point of view, addressing whether or not you feel that the piece is engaged or not. And a lot of that can come from the language of color as well as composition. So I hope that helps on what a successful critique looks like. It is simply bringing that vocabulary and bringing this is so Da Vinci, this is so high Renaissance, this is so whatever it is that we're looking at, and showing you why I think that and how I'm observing that by pointing exactly to what I'm looking at in the piece. Good luck, and we'll speak soon.